Well, this week we'll be returning the writs to the state governors for the Senate and to the Governor-General for the House of Representatives, and that marks the legal completion for the AEC of the 2022 election. And given that, I thought it might be opportune to update you on a few issues about the election. Now, put simply, this was a very different election and enormously challenging from an electoral administrator's viewpoint. It wouldn't have been delivered without the dedication of our polling officials. The election has been an important community accomplishment, and I'm incredibly proud of and grateful for the community members who put their hand up in a pandemic to help all Australians have their say. 121,000 just everyday Australians worked for us during the election, from single-day frontline staff to longer-term material officers and counting staff. They worked long hours, wore masks, and did what is at times a very repetitive but important job, all for the good of democracy. This election presented the AEC with the biggest staffing challenge we've ever had in any election. Effectively trying to run the election while the pandemic is still raging was a difficult thing for the AEC, and just like for every other industry, we've had difficulty in retaining our staff and replenishing those staff when there are vacancies. In the last week alone, we had something like 20% of our workforce drop out as a result of COVID or flu, and we had to pull out all stops to make sure that we could staff all the polling places on polling day. In order to make sure we opened every single planned polling place, we even had our Chief Financial Officer in a remote Western Australian polling place, and people across our administration, finance, communications and legal areas were sent to don the purple and yellow vests. While the election still consisted of most of the usual services we provide, such as postal voting, early voting centres, mobile voting teams and voting centres on election day itself, the services looked different and were used differently. COVID safety measures meant different staffing roles, more materials and altered procedures. We also saw a record number of people attend an early voting centre, 5.54 million this time around, and a record number of postal voters by a long way, some 2.73 million applications, which was an increase of over 1 million from 2019. Quite simply, elections are large scale, they're huge events, and sometimes it's so huge it's difficult to comprehend all of the statistics. This time around, given the pandemic, we had a slightly larger footprint for our remote area mobile polling, which we call a ramp. Also, we had a different overseas offering with a boosted service with courier votes going out, and also citizens could then access diplomatic mail with it coming back. At the same time, for the first time ever, we provided telephone voting for COVID-affected electors, and about 75,000 people used that service as well. So different, but still a big reach for the AEC services. Now, none of these individual services operated in a vacuum. Despite the challenges, there were more voters than ever before. 17.22 million Australians were enrolled. And that's a rate of almost 96.8% of those eligible, a modern democratic miracle, and more than 800,000 increase on 2019. It's a little early and we're still analysing, but the turnout rate is likely to be just a little under 90%. And coming off a similarly good electoral roll in 2019, this does represent a decrease. The pandemic will have been a contributing factor, and that's also something we've seen domestically and overseas during COVID, sometimes to a much greater extent than in Australia. Now, as an independent commissioner and of course as an Australian, it's hard not to focus on the decrease and be a little disappointed. But with the challenge of COVID and the context of participation in overseas democracies, Australia has such comparative strength in this area. There were many heartening stories of participation, from letters I received from quite young children desperately wanting to vote, to a polling official report of the sense of joy a new citizen expressed to them from being able to vote with freedom for the first time in their life. Now, turnout will be an area we delve into to learn lessons for elections moving forward. Not just about our voter services, but also just what further or different communication and engagement we might be able to do to encourage people to actively seek out and plan their vote. Our advertising appeared across TV, radio, outdoor, digital and social media with millions of impressions. An official guide was sent to every single household, and our organic work on social media alone saw many millions of impressions. People also contacted us in traditional channels in droves, we took something like 370,000 calls and replied to 41,000 public inquiry emails. The count was different at this election as well, and the rise in independent candidates and the votes for those independents meant that we had to reset a larger number of the two candidate preferred options that we had set before the election. In total, the logistical exercise that is the count involves 40,000 transport routes and a sum total of hundreds of millions of individual preference checks, a combination of initial counts, the secondary count we do for all ballots, and a full distribution of preferences. The AEC is very proud to have delivered the 2022 federal election, particularly given the pandemic is still with us. Now, right now, we're moving to the Lessons Learned program, so we can pick up those lessons, apply them to future elections, and to make sure that the AEC continues to deliver the franchise for all Australians to be able to vote safely and securely and for their votes to count. Authorised by the Electoral Commissioner, Canberra.